adding the link to the latest newsletter and how to become a Marin Conservation League member. So tonight's title, Armando Quintero, From Ranger to Director. We're really lucky and fortunate. Somewhat of a hometown familiar face, and we've had experience, and Marin Conservation League has long history and knowledge of Armando, but Armando's now gone to the big state stage. I hope that's not you putting your face in your hands because of the new assignment. But no, we're really grateful to have you here in your new role, maybe not so new anymore. But before you became the California Department of Parks and Recreation lead, you have a lot of history, both with the National Park Service and then here with Marin Municipal Water District. Many things you might want to hit upon in your past, from working at the Sequoia National Park and John Muir National Historic Site. So we're just grateful for the diversity of your background. Your track record demonstrates a commitment to conservation that's fully in line with Marin Conservation League, and we know that you know us well. So it's a nice way for us to start these after hours educational forums, and really a nice way to get to know you and your agenda for California and California parks going forward. So with that, our plan is, Director Quintero, Armando, our plan is to turn it over to you and have you share some initial thoughts and things that are happening at the state level. I think you might even be helping us understand anthropause, potentially, if I understand that right. But then we will, as you wrap up your comments, we'll be moving to a question and answer session. And so for those of you, as you take in the comments and some of the discussion points that Armando brings up, please feel free to use chat. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll be kind of grouping questions. I have a few questions ready as well from the Marin Conservation League board. So with that, we can't thank you enough for making the time tonight. Sure. Actually, I'll say this as the last part of the introduction. You were very gracious about being our backup for our annual dinner in the case that our other guests couldn't make it. I think this is a better way to give you the whole stage for almost an hour and really get to know you. So thank you for joining us. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, David. I told a story to the crew that was getting us on right before we started here, and I think I'll just tell it to all of you. And that is that, because you've talked about my background and everything, David, and just a few weeks after I started in this role, I got a call from a friend and colleague who I had hired as a park ranger when I was managing Alcatraz in the early 90s. His name is George DeJarian. He had just returned from the Peace Corps, newly married, new baby, and he wanted to be a park ranger. And he was volunteering with national parks, and I hired him, and just the most delightful human being you could imagine. And 2 years ago, George got diagnosed with early age onset Alzheimer's. And he called me 2 weeks after I started to congratulate me. And he was telling me why he thought I deserved this job and everything. And I had to stop him. And I said, George, hang on a second. And I thanked him for the call for this reason. And I said, George, all of us go forward having been influenced by all the people in our lives. We are sort of the collective of the people that we work with, that we live with, that we interact with. And so I said to him, George, you're going into this job with me. And we both got sort of emotional. And I actually think about that call almost every single day in this role. The things that I've learned from so many people is part of what I bring to this role, and it really is quite extraordinary. I'll give you just a little context, and I hope to only talk for a few minutes here. Some of you have heard this story, but I think it gives you a framework in terms of where I am. I started in this role on September 1st. And you remember that in September 1st of 2020, the world was on fire. The pandemic was heating up. We had social unrest everywhere. We were heading into an election. And I was supposed to go to Sacramento to get sworn in. And the day before I was to get sworn in, I got a call from the secretary and he said, you need to go to Santa Cruz. You're going to go to the Emergency Operations Center be there at 8 o'clock. We're going to swear you in by Zoom. Then you're going to get a tour of Big Basin, which was still smoldering from the fire that destroyed that park and virtually all the historic buildings within it. And he goes, and then around noon, the governor's going to show up and you're going to walk with the governor through Big Basin. That was my first day on the job. So I arrived, I did my swearing in by Zoom. The superintendent for Big Basin, who's a really wonderful fellow named Chris Spohr, meets me and he goes, hey, I'm going to introduce you to some of your staff. And these were all park rangers and park staff that had been fighting fire for weeks. And as we turned the corner, he leaned over and he said, 3 or 4 of these people lost their homes in Big Basin while they were evacuating the visitors. 2,000 people were evacuated from Big Basin during that big fire. Nobody got hurt. They got everybody out. And I walk around the corner and here's 3, 4 dozen people standing there looking like they'd been fighting fire for weeks, looking like they'd lost everything. And the first words out of my mouth were, my heart is on the ground. I mean, what could I say? It was a stunning beginning. And so I met with everybody and it was really quite a heartful experience. And then I jumped in a Ranger truck with a couple other folks and a few Ranger vehicles. And we went up to the headquarters, toured the park quickly. They set up maps and everything for the governor's tour. Governor arrived and we did a tour, but of course the Rangers did the talking. I hadn't been there before, honestly. So who was I to give a tour? But as we were finishing the tour and walking back, I happened to be speaking with the governor, and it was just 1 of 2 minutes that I spoke with him on that first day. And he stopped, and everybody behind us stopped, and it included members of the media, staff, executives, all kinds of folks. And he said, hey, I want to introduce you to our new state parks director. He was just sworn in 5 hours ago. And he introduces me and he goes, Armando, why don't you give us your vision for the California State Park System? That was my introduction to this role. And I can tell you that it's sort of been like that every day since. And what I responded ended up being, the secretary and the deputy secretary and my immediate team had been saying, hey, you need to figure out what your first 100 days are going to be, and not knowing that I was going to be quizzed on it right there. And in such a dramatic setting, here's what I said. In some version of this, I said, the first state lands that were set aside were in Yosemite, so over 160 years ago. And since that time, we have, as a society and as agencies that manage these lands, we've developed these traditions, right? And I said, look around us. I don't think we got it right. And so here we are at the very first state park, Big Basin, set aside in 1902 by the state legislature because of the political will and power of the Semper Virens Fund. So from the very beginning, state parks were a birth of public advocacy groups, just like you and the state legislature. And I said, so here we are again. We get to start over with the very first state park. So what are we going to do? We need to bring in the best science, the best cultural resources, knowledge that we have, the best natural resources that we have. We're going to need to be looking at roads and bridges and infrastructure and figuring out if we really should be rebuilding things the way we built them over the last 100 years. So we literally have an opportunity to look forward and think, how do we manage public lands and these incredible landscapes of California in a way that truly makes them sustainable for the next century and centuries? And that's going to be our challenge. And I went through and talked about we're looking now at climate change impacts and increased population, issues of diversity and access. And then I finished by saying, and so here we are with this pandemic that's literally, and I didn't use this term, but it's what I think of now, and that is that we all during this pandemic got pushed into the lifeboats of our homes. And everybody was hungry, as you know, for the out of doors and hungry for the physical exercise, the spiritual sort of recovery, the mental exercise, mental health, all of that became urgent. And so we sit here at a moment when we have to rebuild this iconic state park with more demand than we've ever seen, and understanding pretty clearly that these are essential landscapes. So that's our job, is how do we take care of these essential landscapes? So I like to think, or, you know, as I've thought about this at different moments, I was born in fire on this role. And it was really a stunning and unpredictable beginning. And so the interesting thing, of course, is because the pandemic was heating up until just weeks ago, I have been a virtual director for state parks. I have been meeting with staff just like you and I are meeting right now. I have been reading a lot of the materials about state parks, around the issues of state parks, listening to staff, visiting state parks virtually. I did go out to a few parks, but it was under really constrained conditions. So I really didn't get to meet people, but I did get out to see some of the parks where we had critical issues. And I'll mention just a couple things and then go into some questions that David had sent to me a few days ago. A few weeks after I'd started, I was talking to a group of interpretive rangers, and one of the questions that I got shortly after we started the question and answer was, so Armando, they said, what do you want your legacy to be? And I said, I'm not thinking about legacy. I'm thinking about how do I do work that actually is going to be carried forward. And so I'm not interested in shiny objects. And so I don't know, I need to figure out what are the structural things that we can do that really are going to make sense to enough people that they will carry forward. And then I got the question again, and I said, okay, I'll pick a legacy item. And I said, I would love it if in a few years, every single state park had some formal acknowledgement of whose ancestral lands that place is, or each park should really be stating, these are the ancestral lands of X or Y. And I said, to see that would be really, amazing. Whether it's in print, whether it's what we talk about, but statewide, there's 280 parks, 600 miles of coastline. Or shoreline, I should say, 300 miles of coastline. Really just a significant amount of California has a state park label on it. And I think it's a perfect backdrop to really acknowledge the first people. And so that was my response. My first several weeks, I really focused on budget because the state parks budget is large. In the past, there have been budgets of $1 billion, $1.5 billion. There are almost 6,000 employees in state parks when everything is geared up in summer. It is a large operation, and within that state park system, there are 9 off-highway vehicle areas. And there was a lot of learning for me to do around how these different areas are managed, what the issues are, what the budgets for each look like. So I spent a lot of time looking at that. And then, of course, I was steeped in the very difficult political issues. And in fact, when I was interviewing for the role, I was introduced to some really hot political topics. And I thought, the only thing we can do is really meet those head on. And that has been with, from the beginning, a big focus for me. And my daily role is dealing with a lot of difficult political issues, as well as a lot of good news things. So every day is quite the mix. One of the surprises that occurred when I went into state parks was to realize that state parks for some time has been managing public grants programs that are invested in communities throughout the state, outside of 280 state parks. And these are grants programs from Prop 68, Prop 1. There's a federal grants program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And since the year 2000, state parks has directed almost $3 billion into communities around the state, around California. And that's for things like nature trails, taking abandoned lots and turning them into playgrounds, funding education programs at zoos, building community centers, building swimming pools, and really delivering recreational opportunities to communities that don't have that. And so I was stunned by that number but I was even more stunned that I'd never heard about that program. And one of the things that I started saying is, what do you mean 280 state parks? We've got all these fingerprints around California that are because of state parks. And we really need to take advantage of that, because I, as a kid who grew up in a place where I didn't go to parks, I didn't know what the parks were in my vicinity. I didn't know that a mile from my house, there was a National Historic Site, a part of the National Park Service. And so I really think of those existing investments that you and I have made through grants and things around the state are something that we really need to recognize as a state parks entree to communities, to let folks know that they have opportunities in their communities, but we also need to connect that to the Point Reyes, Tamales Bay State Park, Mount Tam, all these other places that are just beyond our neighborhoods for these kids and communities. So the grants program was really a shocking and exciting opportunity. And the numbers for those investments vary every year. This year, we are actually going to be distributing $460 million in California for projects like that. We actually had $2 billion worth of project applications. So anyway, as I've been looking at all this with my background in working for various organizations and parks, I have been looking at our organization and how it's structured, what we're doing, what I think we need to do. State Parks is fortunate to have significant and powerful park partners: Save the Redwoods League, Sempervirens Fund, the California State Parks Foundation, and a new entity called Parks California, which is a legislatively created partner, which is a quasi-governmental nonprofit. So we can take funding that we get, and in certain conditions, we can house that money with that nonprofit partner so that we can use it over the course of a few years rather than needing to meet the budget cycle. But there's obviously a structure to that. And then I'll finish my first comments here by saying that ultimately my interest and the governor's interest, and I really believe in this, and that is that our job is to really create a state where everybody realizes that parks are for all. And so as I talk, I'll be talking about some of those programs. I just talked a whole bunch. Why don't I go to questions? Because I'm sure you're going to hit on some of the things that I would have mentioned, and I want to hear what you want to know about, because I could, and some of you know, like Sue Morris and Lou and Pat Zullo and a bunch of folks on the Bonnie Morse, you all know that I could talk forever. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to look at the chat right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's start with one that's there. And of course, Zoom lets us enter into each other's homes in ways that maybe we didn't before. But there's one asking, Armando, about the Ranger hat and the guitar, and I'll even throw in the mandolin. I think I see there. Just what's that about in terms of background or experience?
I have 3 felt Ranger hats. That's my first one. I got that one in 1976 when I was a brand new park aide or ranger at the John Muir home. So it's my, that's what it is. It's my first Ranger hat. And I, for a long time, between high school and somewhere in college, honestly, I didn't date for a couple of years because I was tired of that. And I got a guitar and a mandolin and I learned how to play them. And they've been my accompaniment for many things over the years. And I'm self-taught with that. And I like to play with friends. And actually my first mandolin was a gift. I need to contact those folks and tell them what they did, because it's one of my favorite instruments. So it's my meditation.
Great.
Honestly.
Oh, that's fun. That's great. Well, let's use another question in the chat that kind of picks up on your threads there about fingerprints and lots of parks for all. There's a question here about a local resource, the Marconi Conference Center, and reopening that. And what would be the park's role in that? And specifically, George Clyde's asking, helping it to survive as a public resource conference center, offering reasonable rates to nonprofit organizations, a foundation? Question mark? Yeah.
Thank you, George, for that question. One of my big interests is lower cost accommodations. And I've already met with the board that has the agreement with Parks to run Marconi Cove. And right now they're looking for a new partner, which we are very excited about, because the idea is literally to create a facility where there's lower cost accommodations on the coast. And I've actually gone out there with the director of the Coastal Conservancy, and I've also been speaking with the folks at the Coastal Commission about paying attention to places like Marconi, which offer really an extraordinary experience that's accessible. And also, I love the idea of the coast being a place where, like in Europe, you can travel from low cost accommodation place to the next, whether you're walking or on a bike. And I think that that is that's an incredible opportunity. And I went out there in December and toured it with the folks and talked about possible futures there. We do have, State Parks has a new partnerships office, and I am really focused on making sure that there's so many good examples, as you all know, of good partnerships out there. And I think that we have the ability to really expand on that in state parks. So that's a great question. Thanks.
Maybe with that response and kind of that thread, maybe we go to the funding picture overall for parks, for California parks. And, you know, acknowledging that there's been some interesting and challenging chapters over the last decade or so for funding the parks in California. And just what are, you know, your estimates in the face of what was originally cuts and now surpluses? What's happening for funding and the status of funding and support for California parks?
Budgets for state parks have really varied quite a bit. As you know, probably one of the low points in state parks was 2008 to 2014, really took some really big hits. The budget that we put together, and that's another thing that I learned about, is the budget cycle in the state. And very quickly, what happens is all the agencies work with the governor's office and in January submit proposals for the next budget year. So we did that, and I participated in that. And the budget that we submitted in January was for just under $1 billion for California State Park System. But it did include money for a couple of significant things. One is, it's been a long time since State Parks has made new acquisitions of parklands. And the governor, the secretary, and I are very interested in acquiring new lands that expand the system by looking at things like critical connectivity for existing parks, as well as potential new lands that are out there. And another thing that we looked at was deferred maintenance. As you know, as you all know, with public lands, there's a lot of deferred maintenance. And something that State Parks has done in the last few years is they've put together, and I have to say that I've inherited a lot of really good work that's been done over time, but especially in the last few years. And so, for example, right now we have $200 million worth of deferred maintenance projects that are ready to go. The projects are planned, we have all the permits, and the idea is that we want to have enough of an inventory there that any opportunistic funding, we can put it in the ground right away. So that's a really impressive piece of work. And part of that came was because several years ago, there was a $60 million allocation to state parks. And State Parks wasn't ready, and they were only able to use about 15 million of that. So everybody said, well, you can't do that again. So not only has it happened for deferred maintenance, but the same has occurred with new land acquisition. So there's an inventory of properties that have been identified. In some cases, they're properties that have been purchased by park partners, like Trust for Public Land, Nature Conservancy, the conservancies that work with specific parks like Mount Diablo and others, where they've purchased land and are holding it for state parks. So there's a number of properties there. So our first budget, like I said, was right around $1 billion, and it included new positions for key areas. And excuse me. And then what happens with the state budget is that goes in January. The governor approves it and forwards forwards that budget to the legislature. But then what happens is there's sort of there's something called the May revision, which is, hey, this is what the budget picture actually looks like for the next fiscal year. And as you all know, this year there was a lot of talk about a budget surplus, and it's pretty significant. And so we were approached by the governor's office, by the secretary's office, and we put in an additional budget amount of work for almost $700 million. And the amazing thing, and I can talk about that just really quickly to give you a sense, we are looking at really putting a bunch of money into the state operations, hiring a number of new permanent positions, putting money into a reimbursement fund where when I talked about the grants program that went out to the communities of $3 billion since the year 2000, we're putting an extra 100 million in there so we can look at really critical issues. We also looked at hiring new positions around these local assistant programs. We increased the amount of money in our capital outlay. We also, in our original budget, include things like some significant wildland and wildfire resiliency work. And so one of the things, and I'll stop with this, but just to give you a sense, we are actually in the process right now of hiring 7 foresters for state parks. They're going to be assigned to different bioregions in California to put together the fire plans for those areas. And we also are purchasing a significant amount of equipment so we can do that work to reduce the catastrophic wildland fire. And we actually have funding for this year to get that work started. And right for the last few years, State Parks has been doing treatment of wildlands to the tune of about 2,000 to 4,000 acres a year. We this year, for the next 10 years, are embarking on at least 25,000 acres a year of forest treatments. So there's a lot of work that's going on there. And honestly, the leadership team at State Parks, they all keep telling me as we're working on juggling all of this, almost fairly regularly, people will just pause and say, we never thought we'd see support like this for state parks. It's really literally a watershed moment. So that's a long answer.
No, that's useful. And I think there are a couple questions here I'll group together in the chat based on the response. I'm going to kind of combine Susan Stomp's question or concern with Andrew Kive's comment and question. Susan just voiced a concern. I think you can read it there, and I'll just help paraphrase for those that aren't reading the chat that, her passion and volunteering for parks, but a concern that parks without staff and specifically without rangers creates an issue for the visitors, for the parks and the future of the parks. Can this problem be fixed? And then, Andrew's there mentioning, it's good to hear about this funding for the parks, but it seems that volunteer operated parks are excluded. Is that the case? Maybe touch on that in the face of the budget discussion and just how this watershed moment and opportunity to support
Sure.
parks. Yeah.
I don't know if Susan Stomp is the person who I met at Olin Poly. I was hiking there several weeks ago and went up around the back to where the native plant garden is. And there was a group of volunteers working there, and I went over and talked with them, and we were talking, and they were like, who are you? Because I was asking questions, and when I told them I was the director, they were pretty shocked. But that's what I do. I have a bunch of friends on the screen that know that I like to go to parks on my days off. But absolutely right. And we're really facing a challenge in terms of what COVID has done. It's created a much larger audience that's interested in parks. And that's a challenge that we're all working on right now. And it needs cooperation with adjacent land managers and messaging. And there's a lot of work to do there. But we are also looking at increasing staffing. We just added 44 rangers a few weeks ago to the workforce in state parks, and they've distributed all through the system. I know it's not enough. And then in terms of funding available to the parks, there are volunteer operated parks. I'm assuming that Andrew is talking about something like China Camp. And China Camp, I mean, are just really extraordinary partners. I've gone there several times since I've been in this role, and I've met with the leadership team there. And we do provide funding for those parks. They also are able to retain the funding from the fees that they charge for use. China Camp, for example, has a cycling permit fee, and we have a family permit fee for China Camp. And so there are mechanisms that we can do to expand the financial support in partnership with park partners like volunteers like China Camp. The question about, I saw the note from Lou and Pat Zulo about state parks having rangers whose job it is to go to schools. One of the proposals that we have in with this May revise is actually expanding a program that was started in Marin 4 years ago. And that is that the Marin County parks purchase park passes for state and national parks and distributes them to the libraries in Marin. And kids can check out park passes for a week and take their families to parks. I propose that we expand that program to all of California. And I met with the chief librarian, the director of the libraries for the state, and his deputy, along with my chief deputy, who I have to say is just the most amazing partner. Her name is Liz McGurk. And I couldn't have asked for a more brilliant partner in working with state parks. So Liz and I met with the director of libraries for the state. And the idea is that we're going to be purchasing passes, park passes, distributing them to all the libraries. Kids can check them out for a week. And what we're talking about is having librarians become partners with parks. And you've all seen children's library sections where librarians will put together collections of books on various topics. And we already are imagining that we're going to see libraries with basically collections of books. And I just think it's an exciting project. And in fact, the first partner, Jennifer, is really interested in supporting these and other access programs with us. In fact, I was honestly, just a few hours ago, I was on the phone with her staff talking about these kinds of programs.
Great. I'm going to have you follow up because I think Larry's question is somewhat relevant to what you're talking about in terms of creating opportunities for all communities. This is more maybe a career readiness. So Larry's asking, how about a companion fire force resiliency jobs creation program that could go a long way to addressing underserved communities and sure. Other even homeless segments? So,
sure.
Yeah.
Well, and that's something that I am working to become stronger partners with our other state agency leaders, like the Conservation Corps, working with certainly with CAL FIRE and other groups. There's also a new department called the Climate Corps, which you can think of it as a new workforce of workers very similar to Conservation Corps. And that's what we're all talking about right now, is how do we spread the labor out to the state and get them into critical areas with the training and the funding. And it certainly feels like a WPA moment in a way, doesn't it? Especially coming out of this pandemic and a real need to put ourselves back to work. So, I'm not saying that that's what it is, but it's certainly an opportunity. And I'll tell you, I don't have to say this, but with this extraordinary drought that we're in, we absolutely need to be investing in the landscapes that sustain us. And we have to do more. So Great. Absolutely.
Let me kind of come back to a question Tom Boss posed and maybe relate it to one we gave you in advance. He's asking about acquisitions in the interior cities where, in other urban areas where parks are lacking. And we were interested in hearing, the parks role in Governor Newsom's executive order about 30 by 30, the protection of 30% of California's land and water by 2030. Maybe you could handle them separately, or if they're related, however you might see them, please.
They're related. Great question, Tom. Thank you for that. We are looking at, it is surprising the landscapes that are in urban areas. And not that this is something that we're looking at, but I'll just tell you some examples that I'm aware of. I mean, right in Los Angeles, there is a massive former oil field that actually doesn't need that much remediation. That's right in the middle of the city. And there are a number of examples where urban areas have been basically recovered by state parks. And I'll just step aside for just a moment to say this. What has become really clear to me is no matter the property or properties that state parks has acquired over the years, every single one of them needs some level of restoration. Every single one of them has roads that were cut, without a knowledge of what that does to the landscape. Or even things like there are 9 off-highway vehicle parks in the state park system. There's a separate division that manages those. And I'll say a couple things about those just as an example. They're heavily used, but for many years before they were in parks' hands, they were not regulated. So they were trashed. But what happens with the off-highway vehicle programs is we're able to take the income from gas taxes and other things and actually invest them in those areas. So where we have parks that might have an annual resources budget of $40,000, a single OHV park could have a science and resources budget of $2 million. And and the work that I'm seeing being done, because it takes time to do restoration, as you all know, we have really good scientists working in a variety of habitats. And I like to think that the areas where there is OHV activities, we're able to use the knowledge and the work that's going on the ground there to affect the work that we do in a region. And so in terms of the question about 30 by 30, this secretary and this governor have added positions in the Secretary of Resources office that are really interesting. One of my favorite new positions is a Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitats. We're the only state in the nation that has that. Her name is Jen Norris. She's an amazing biologist, used to work for US Fish and Wildlife. She is a great partner. When I go to parks, she goes with me and we talk about exactly this. Because what we think about is that 30 by 30 is not only adding new landscape acreage to the percentage of California that's protected, but it's also improving the habitat in the acreage that we already manage. And I think about things like when you start looking at all the agencies that we have the Department of Transportation, which has properties throughout the state, and Fish and Wildlife, the State Fish and Wildlife, a lot of their properties are not open to the public. But they're going to start opening those properties to the public. And what we're starting to do is look at areas where we can all go in and create levels of partnership where we're managing these areas truly for the long-term biodiversity value and habitats through things like dam restoration, habitat restoration. What we're also doing is looking at public-private partnerships. There's a fellow who lives right here in San Rafael. His name is Adam Davis, and he's a principal in a company called Ecosystem Partners. And they go out and seek private capital, and then they turn around and look at restoration projects and invest. And I know that since they started that company, they've invested over $2 billion of ecosystem improvements. And right now, his company is doing a massive restoration program in the Delta. And so when we talk about 30 by 30, I think of it as increasing acreage that's included in protected lands. It's restoring those areas within these protected lands. And it's also looking for creative interagency cooperation. And I will also say this, and I'll finish with this, and that is that having worked on the creation of one TAM, I really think that all parks should be talking about their role in as being a role in a part of a system. And state parks are a perfect provide a perfect roadmap for regional cooperation. And there are several parks where that's already happening. Of course, Mount Tam is one. Redwood National Park is basically the focus of something called Redwoods Rising. It's an amazing partnership between tribes, National Park Service, and state parks. And I'll say that at Redwood State Park, two things that I'll bring up to come to mind. One of them is that we've recently hired Yokut, members of the Yokut tribes to be interpretive rangers and employees in the park. These are people who actually speak their traditional language. So at Redwood, you now can see interpretive programs that are delivered in English and Yokut. I said earlier that one of my dreams would be that there would be land acknowledgement, traditional land acknowledgement. And a few months ago, I was talking to the superintendent at Redwood, who you all know, Victor Velagic, who used to be on Mount Tam. He's now the superintendent up there, and he's really doing an incredible job. And I was talking with Victor and one of his interpreters, and they said, we were talking about a dedication ceremony in August, but they said, hey, they said, Armando, we did something else that we want to tell you about, and we're going to install these things in June. And I need to find out when they're actually doing this. They said, we met with the tribes and we've created this new signage, and at every entrance to Redwood State Park, there's going to be these large signs that say, you are now entering the ancestral lands of the Yokut people. And I said, did you get, and I said, tell me how you did that. And they said, well, we worked with the 3 different tribes that were a part of that region. And they got an agreement that that was the language that they would use. And then they told me something that was, I think, spectacularly beautiful. And that is that an elder, it was one of the women in the community, came forward and she said, since you're going to be doing these signs, I think you should put a basketry design across the top of these signs. And she came forward with several designs, and they said, well, which one do you think we should use? And she selected one, and she said, this one. And they said, what's the significance of that? And she said, it's the regional design for the it's the regional design for the friendship baskets.
Yeah.
And I think of actions like that as signals, and a signal is not enough. I think that as parks and as public land managers that we all are, I am really interested in connecting those signals with significant actions like repatriation of Native American remains, which are in storage in California, having been set aside when there's been road projects and things like that. And so we are actually putting together a pretty big program. We're hiring 7 Native Americans to work with the archives in California to work on getting all of the remains back into their communities. And so when I mention signal, I also think we need heartfelt action that really tie to these lands that we all share. So for me, the 30 by 30 notion is huge and spans the things that I just said.
Well, we could take this a number of ways based upon that, and really appreciate responses to both questions, the urban opportunities and the 30 by 30. I think I'm going to manage time a little bit and just turn your attention to drought. I think it's too important to not save time and just get to it. So direct question here from Susan Morris, just asking you about state parks plan to mitigate drought effects on natural resources. And, we wanted also to have you back up with your experience on the Marin Municipal Water District and just kind of share your sense of what's different about this drought and how we all might be responding to it as local communities, water districts, California state parks.
Honestly, I mean, obviously we have to understand as individuals how much water we're using, what it truly costs. I don't know if anybody on the screen could answer this question right now. Could any of you tell me how much water you get for $1 when you pay your water bill? Most people can't answer that question. And in Marin, It's right now, it's a little less than 100 gallons. When I first started on the water board and we went to raise the water rates by 3%, and this was 2009, and you thought that we'd set the world on fire. And in a crowded meeting, I asked the room, you're all here to complain about pricing water. How much water do you get for $1? Nobody knew. And at the time, it was 280 gallons for $1. And so we don't and here's the other thing is I started looking, and I was new on the water board. So I started looking at what does water really cost? And what does our bill really pay for? And 20% of your water bill is actually for electricity that it takes to process, deliver, treat your water. And so there's a lot of knowledge around water that we don't understand. And I think this notion that water is expensive is absolutely absurd. And the real cost that we have to be looking at, and here's my answer. The cost of our water should be the cost that it takes to manage the watershed. It should be the cost for and by manage the watershed, one of the things that is most important for climate to address climate change is actually soil health. Soil can sequester far more carbon than all the vegetation on the planet. And so educating the public about the value of soil health, and that's something we can each do in our yards. I've actually spent years cultivating my yard with native plants, and I know that the soils in my yard are super healthy. And if we did more of that, we could actually mitigate climate impacts. And certainly when we're talking about large landscapes like Mount Tam and the Sierra Nevada, soil health is really something that we have to be paying attention to. And a part of that is having control burn programs, having all of that in place. There's a lot of things that we know we need to do. We're at least starting to do them, but in the urgency of this drought, I think what we have to do is be very truthful. And I'm not going to get the years right, but I know that there were 2 mega droughts in the last 1,500 years, right? And there was one mega drought between 800 and 950. And what a mega drought is exactly what we're in right now. We have dry, hot years, and then an occasional heavy wet year, or maybe 1 or 2 wet years. But what ends up happening is the soils dry out, and exactly what we're seeing is what happens. So I think we should be thinking, so how do we manage water? How do we manage landscapes if this is a mega drought? How do we change our behavior? And there was another mega drought that occurred, I think it was 1100 to 1300. And 2 amazing examples of what happened during those droughts is that if you dive down about 100, 150 feet in Lake Tahoe or in Lake Tenaya, what you will encounter is stands, whole forests, mature forests standing there on what seems like the bottom of the lake. But those mega droughts lasted long enough that that's how much water evaporated from Lake Tenaya and Lake Tahoe. So it's serious. And I think that one of the resources that we don't have it here as much, but one of the ways that we've really compromised ourselves, I think, as a society is our lack of care that we took for the groundwater in California. In a quick nutshell, if you take all of the water equivalent of a typical snow year in the Sierra Nevada, it's something like 18 million acre feet of water. An acre foot is 1 acre, 1 foot deep. 3 acre feet of water is about 1 million gallons. It's an easier number. So about 18 million acre feet of water is what's in a typical snowpack. If you take all the reservoirs that we've built in California, it's 40 million acre feet of storage. So think about Lake Orville, Folsom Lake, they're all drying out. That's 40 million acre feet of store in the reservoirs here in Marin. That's included in that number. If you look at the soil moisture in the state, that would be about 80 million acre feet of water in healthy soils. Then here's the kicker. When you look at groundwater in the state of California, what there should be is about 1 billion acre feet of water. but we've been using it without replenishing it. And right now there's about a 200 million acre deficit. And if we had been caring for our aquifers in the state, we would have a reserve beneath our feet. If we'd had healthier forests, we would have these sponges in places like Mount Tam that are releasing water slowly, that are actually in a more fire resilient landscape. And so I think we've all grew up with the term fire prevention. I think we need to be looking at now fire resilience, and we also need to be looking at climate resilience. It's tough to talk about climate change prevention, but we are in the middle, I think, of a major mind shift. And so I think in this drought, we need to get our neighbors well aware of the importance of conserving water. I don't know what programs I would put in place, but I know that a big component would be some very serious education, because without that, things like conservation don't make a lot of sense to people. So anyway.
No, great. Armando, with no, that was wonderful. And with that kind of direction you're pointing about drought and now into fire fuels management, those are landscape scale objectives, right? Not just a particular park or a particular other kind of jurisdiction of land. So just curious, your thoughts or examples that you might have of how California Parks is engaging in those larger landscape scale management and objectives and coordination with other partners. You've hit upon a couple, but maybe dive into a specific example.
Well, I mean, I think it's really, it's been park partnerships. Santa Monica Mountains is, there's state park partners down there. And honestly, we have been trying to understand how to manage these landscapes, and we understand that we just need to manage them more aggressively. And I do think that landscape scale networks are really the direction that we have to head in. And with state parks, personally, I have been looking at, and this is a personal interest, not a program or anything yet, but I do think that there are prime regions where we could put together some model landscape scale networks that really start to plug in a wide portfolio of partners. And I'll give you some examples. There's a company called Blue Forest, and they are an investment company that takes private capital, and they go out and they thin forests, and you get a return on your investment because of the improved forest health, reduced fire risk, improved water capture. And they're longer term investments, but there's more companies like that that are popping up. And I think that what we need to be doing in state parks is literally looking at what is the diversity of portfolio that we can bring to the challenges of state parks, which is neighboring lands, groups like ecosystem partnership, groups like Blue Forest. And I mean, we just have to get the work on the ground. We're in a really tough spot. I mean, I'm not being Pollyanna-ish at all, but I do think it's achievable. And I do think that, and I can see several resources managers on the screen. You have to pick the hotspots and the priorities. And also we have to think about the infrastructure that we're putting in there. Because we are creating, we're starting a lot of these fires ourselves. So anyway, it's yeah. All of that.
No, helpful, very helpful. Thank you. We're close to end, and I recognize one more question in the chat that if you maybe a quick 30-second update, and then we can give you last words that you want to share, but just any pertinent updates on what's called the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation program. Is there anything relevant that we should know about or coming from that?
We have the challenge of public land managers of both preserving the landscape and allowing for recreation. And we're looking hard at that. One of the things that I think has been difficult is that makes it challenging is a lot of these areas there's several jurisdictions, several regulators, if you will. So state parks, we have lands that actually belong to the Bureau of Reclamation that we're managing. So the laws and the rules and regulations of both apply there. So a lot of what I'm finding is the need, honestly, for relationship development with all of those regulatory agencies so that we sit down early and describe together what our goals are and how we get there more smoothly. If you want to see something that I was a part of when it started, I was one of the folks that brought it to the secretary, and that's something called Cutting the Green Tape. And it's actually a state program for removing regulatory barriers when it has to do with environmental restoration. So a simple example is, rather than having to get a permit and go through the whole process, if you're going to restore a stream and having to do that for every 500 feet, now you can get it for the whole darn stream and not waste money on permitting and just get the work done. And I think there's some level of, work. I know that there's a level of work that we can do at the state agency level, state departments level, of working together to do that. And I've reached out and I'm working with partners from DWR, from Fish and Wildlife. And it's interesting because those of you who work in agencies know that our agencies all have their own cultures. And so it's a trick of bringing cultures together and getting language that works for these groups that literally speak different languages. And you know, well, I'll finish with this. I think one of the tools that we have right now, which really has the power to educate and to create common understanding, is something called story maps. It was developed by Esri. And the way that I think of story maps is that rather than two-dimensional maps that all of us have trouble reading and understanding and even comprehending the abstractness of that sort of information, a story map is a video, an interactive video with still images, text, and video that allows you to move through a landscape, travel 1,000 feet above it, look at different issues. And the beauty of it is that the well-done story maps maintain a sense of human scale through the whole thing. And there's not a lot of experiences like that, except for you and I walking through a landscape, and we can't all do that. So I would encourage you to take a look at story maps and ask that people do more of those. It creates immediate understanding in complex situations.
Well, that's a wonderful place for us to wrap up. We're right at time, and we can't thank you enough, Director Quintero, Armando. Please look through the chat. There's a number of accolades and just expressions of gratitude for you stepping into this role and the job you're doing.
Well, I have to tell you that a lot of the folks and faces that I see on the screen are people that I've spent time with, and you have all been a part of my education, and thank you.
Well put, well put. To all of you that have joined us, thank you again for joining Marin Conservation League's first After Hours event. Couldn't have had a better start to what we hope, as I mean that sincerely, a better start to what we hope is a nice complement to other programs that our issues committees and our traditional business breakfasts do. Please give us feedback about that. I want to really make sure to double thank Martha Richter-Smith, and I neglected Kirsten Nolan. Both are behind the scenes Zoom producers. These things don't happen without their wonderful help. And to those that are members, we are so grateful for your level of participation and commitment to conservation in Marin. And to those that are interested, please do look us up and look at ways to join and make that level of commitment for Marin Conservation League. Please, I won't say travel home safely, but please enjoy a safe evening while you're at home. And thank you again for joining us.
Bye, everybody.